Welcome back, everyone, all our word campers. I hope you really enjoyed the yoga session and it was nice and restful, or if you were just taking a lunch break or visiting a sponsored booth, you enjoyed that as well. Introducing Craig West. Craig is a freelance trainer and architect based in Brighton, United Kingdom, who focuses on bringing together the WordPress and non-WordPress worlds. With a previous career in business and accounting, as well as having run his own non-IT related business, Craig can speak both technical and business. So welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Megan. Welcome everyone to the WP REST API and AJAX talk. There's a lot to cover, so what I've done is I've created a resource pack that you can see download here that has all the code files, a handbook with details and instructions and references, and also these slides. And they're available here. And when we go to the demo site, you'll be able to log in if you so wish, though you can use it not being logged in with these details here. So the WordPress REST API and AJAX, what are the desirable outcomes for us today? Well, it's to get a high-level understanding of the REST API, AJAX, and JSON data, how we can add our own fields to these routes that we're going to discuss, how we can create our own routes, how we can use them for GET and POST requests, creating forms, secure the forms with WP-Nonce. And because the REST API is such a powerful source of data that can be used outside of the WordPress stack, we're going to have a look how it can now be used in decoupled and headless WordPress. We'll look at how we can handle authentication. We'll also look at how this can enable us to use some of the other technologies to have offline and almost instant pages, because the brain interprets instant as being less than 100 milliseconds. And we'll also look at the idea of WP-HTML plugins or widgets that connect to WordPress functionality and content that can be deployed in other websites anywhere for increased exposure and service. Realistically, in a half hour, we're not going to be able to cover everything deeply. So what I'm going to do is do this probably twice, a high-level overview to start with, and then returning deeper if time permits. You have the slides and the workbook and the site code, so afterwards you will be able to work your way through it. And if you're a developer like me, you'll break it, make it again, and see how it all works. I recently did a Brighton meetup for WordPress talk. The link's here, so you can see it again. But because I give regular and frequent online workshops, no fee, contact me and I organize some online workshops so we can really go through it in more detail. Because when we see the impact of the REST API, we'll be probably quite amazed, as I was when I started learning, how it can expand WordPress, not to be just the 1/3 of the internet, but to be able to be anywhere on the internet, 100% internet. So a little bit about me, as I was introduced. I'm Craig. I was born 58 years ago. I think that's probably 243 years in tech. And I first started computing in 1979. Now, many of you probably weren't even born then. And this was my first computer. Cut and paste was cut and paste. The first thing we learned was how to repair our program when we trod on it and broke it. And this was my little computer that I worked with. And this is where I am in Brighton, near the English Channel. And I'm about 15 minutes walk from here. I've been involved in IT on and off through the years. Currently, my passions are progressive web apps, offline insight websites, web components, and web speed optimization. And we'll look how the REST API can enable you and your clients to export effectively WordPress as a function as a service or a micro front end on any HTML site. I love teaching and learning, and I volunteer at the Code Bar IO in Brighton, and I'm still just a student. And I very much liked what Nathan said in his talk this morning about the hero syndrome and the imposter syndrome. I think I suffer from both of those. And what I teach my students when I'm coaching them is a good developer is willing to learn, ask questions, and be very persistent. What I've achieved today when I show this presentation is not through talent, it's through endless hours, Googling, trying to make everything work. I've done many talks about WordPress, decoupled WordPress. So what I'd like to do is just clear up some of these terms. The REST API stands for Representational State Transfer, and it was developed by Roy Fielding in 2000 when they found that the SOAP method was quite bulky and cumbersome. And it's an architectural style, it's not a protocol. And HTTP by its very nature is very RESTful. And what it means is that client and server don't need to know each other. When we type in a URL, the server doesn't need to know who we are or formed the previous connection. It will just respond in the same way that any website responds to a URL request. And you can see there's not much on the REST in this thesis, but there's the link if you need it. When we say API, that means an application programming interface. And essentially, that's one bit of software communicating with another. You'll hear me use the term endpoints. If we have a URL like this one here, we can do a get, post, or delete method. And therefore, we can have 3 endpoints. So basically, one URL can have many endpoints. And this is all an endpoint is. If we type this in, and we're going to see this in a moment, we will be able to get data back. And this is what we call endpoints that's in the REST API. AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It should be AJAX in these days because it's JSON or XML, but they keep the X out of respect to it. And basically means we can actually get data without reloading the page, saving on a server trip for all our resources on that page. And there are many libraries like jQuery and Axios that can help us. I use the native API in the browser, which is Fetch. You'll hear me talk about JSON data. It really looks like an associative array, and we're going to see examples of that. And if we treat it like that, that can make it slightly clearer. And we're going to be looking at WordPress hooks. Basically, when we create our own endpoints, we're going to hook into the WordPress core. And that's what I mean by the WordPress hook. So you have the documents. We're now going to go to the Udemy site, and we're going to start looking at some endpoints. This is the site that we're going to work through. But what I'd like to do first is show you what an endpoint actually is. What is the REST API? This is the hello world of the REST API, posts. My site is Udemy on 49plus.co.uk. This is the JSON space, as it were, in WordPress. And this here is what we call the root. And the WP/v2 is a namespace. And posts, well, if we put that in, we'll get back JSON data looking like this. Now, if you get something like this, that's because I've got a little extension that converts it into prettier JSON. So this is an endpoint. This is the REST API, and it's bringing back essentially text data, which maybe in the old days would have been a web page. We can read all the information. You don't need to be logged in to use this site. If we go onto our site, we can see the very first post. And this API REST endpoint brings back the last 10 posts. Now we have many more different types. We can filter by category, for example. We can even reduce the number of fields that we get back. And if we notice here, we're getting an array of objects, an array of arrays. And I'd just like to draw your attention to advanced custom fields and also to this field author name, which doesn't actually exist in this standard endpoint. We've been able to add it, and we're going to learn how to do that. So there are various other endpoints. We can make our own. And if you notice here, I've made mine. I've called it WordCamp v2 and its districts. And we're going to see this data coming back. And you can see it's just key value pairs. Another example, and we can see numerous different types. Let's just quickly have a look at this section here. I've gone to JSON Editor Online. And when I'm in here, what I've done is I've removed this and copied and pasted all of the JSON data into this. If we look at routes here, we can see we've got 80 plus routes. If we look further down, we can see the WP-V2, and we can see all the different routes that are already in the WordPress REST API. We've seen posts already. We've seen some users. If we come up, we can see in this namespace that we have my own ones, WordCamp V2. We can see the advanced custom fields. So what we can really do, let's just shut that down, is see all of that data and see all the routes. So now let's go into the site itself and see the REST API in action. If I go into the AJAX page, I'm getting a couple of buttons here, and I'm going to go into Dev Tools. And if I look at the console log, Dev Tools is F12 or Inspector Tools, More Tools, Developer Tools. If I now click on a button, I'm going to get back a list of those posts, and I'm just showing the ID and the title. And this is that endpoint that we have here. We've seen that before. Point of note, what we get back originally is what's called a stream, which is this here. But we use a function, which we'll look at later, to convert it. And if we look here, we will see that we have got all those posts that we saw before, author name. We can see, if we come down here, the title. And we can also see the content of that post. I've got a custom table, and we can bring back data from our endpoint this way here. So before it seems mysterious like a black box, let's just have a look at what kind of code is needed. Well, bearing in mind that we get this data back, we get an array of 10 posts here. If we look at the code, and I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code. I had that, pardon me, I closed that down by mistake. So we've seen before we go into that, we can also use a search facility. Because if we come now here, we can use a different endpoint that's given to us by WordPress, WP-JSON, WP-V2 post search. If I click on that, I'm getting ID and title. If you go to the site and we type something else in, we get something different here. And we can see these arrays coming back here. So let's have a quick look at how we get that JSON data that can seem unusable into our site. And if we go into the code, if we look at page-AJAX, the actual bit of code that translates that into HTML on the page is essentially here. We come up, loading the data. If we come down to the post version, which was here, I'm just doing a fetch, and I'm not going to go into the detail of the code, but if you've done AJAX or Axis before, we're going to this endpoint, getting the data back, we convert it to JSON, and now what we do here is actually just loop through it and make some HTML and put it into an element on the page. So this can be considered a code snippet, boilerplate. In the workshops, we go into more detail about this, but you can see there's not a lot of code, and it can seem almost intuitive, even if one is not a JavaScript developer. We're looping through an array and putting out the data.id, title rendered. So that is how, when we've done this on our AJAX page, we come click here, we click on the button, we get the data, and there we can see the post, the author name, the ID, the title. So that's getting, and we've seen search. So we've seen two ways that we can get data onto the page using the REST API from something that might have seemed quite horrendous when we first done it. And the difference using AJAX is that we're only doing a small link to actually get the page. If we come back here into the network tab of DevTools, go into AJAX, load posts, we see we fire off the request on demand. So it's not bringing back all the rest, which we would do if we had to refresh the whole page, make a trip to the server and bring all the whole page back, even if some of it may be cached. One thing we do need to do is post data. So I'm in here post, and this is just a basic form. And what we're going to do here is just add in a post. And when I submit it, I'm getting back a custom message that I've made myself saying that it was successful. And if I go into the home page, we'll see that post added here. I'm not doing any client-side rendering, sorry, client-side validation. We can see if we send nothing and this endpoint is expecting things, this is the type of message we get, which we can loop through and display a message to the user. So let's have a quick look at that post page because it's not so different to the get page. What we're doing here is we're getting the form data, we're getting all the values from the form. We create a form data object and append all the fields because then when we send that to the server, we can use server post. It's just a post, like submitting a form. And this time I'm sending it through post, I'm sending the data. And when it comes back, I'm displaying the message that I choose to send back. So how does this all work? Let's have a look now at some of the endpoints and how we use them, because we've seen, shall we say, the client side. Let's have a look at the server side. Now, the first thing, if we go into REST-custom at the very top, we remember we saw that author name. We saw that because when we get back the post by default, we just get an author ID, not the name. So what we've done here is we can add via the hook onto the REST API init a function, and the code to do that is we register the name of the post type, the field we want, and we give it a callback function. And now we can use our standard WordPress to determine what we want to send back. And I wanted to send back the author name. When we looked at those posts, those districts, when we looked at this one here, I was doing it to a custom table and getting the data back. We once again add a root, and this time we give it a namespace. You can use one word here, but it's good practice to have versioning so it's backward compatible or doesn't break people using an old endpoint. I'm calling it districts. And now I'm just really going to my custom table and creating a sort of array of arrays to send back. And this is boilerplate code, template code that's available. So this is how we can add new roots. And this is also how we can amend the roots. So having done that, let's go back and let's have a look at those endpoints. We just saw the districts one, and we saw it came back with those. This is JSON data. And when we see it in the code here, all we do is we're looping through a little table. The table's included in the handout, and just basically getting all the ID and unit name and converting, sending it back using the REST response class so that it comes back as JSON data with a status and returns a response. So we can go through many different types of endpoints. Security is important because if we're giving these people endpoints, how do we know that it came from somebody on our site? And this is where the nonce comes into play. A nonce are a random number that's being generated, and basically it gets sent with the form, and the server will know what it created and can compare it. There's a very good article here that goes into greater detail. But what we can do here is we create a nonce, And all it is when we create it, it's just a token. And we're calling this one, for example, nonce page test. When we send it, the server can check that the hidden field data that's been sent, does it compare with what the server has, and verify that it actually came from that page on that site. And I think if we look at the code, it'll be slightly easier to understand that, because what we're doing here, if we go to the code, it's very much like the post we just saw. And in fact, I didn't show you how that was done. So I'm going to actually show you the one with the nonce. We've created a new route here. And when we look in the code of the actual form on the client side, we can see we're sending it to this endpoint, REST 03. So if we go back to that page, this is the route that we're creating. We're calling it a creatable. That just means post. It's just a variable on the class system. Instead of writing post, we can write post. We're saying what route are we using, what's the callback, what's expected, all the different parameters. We can add validation, and that's how we got that error message when we saw the first form. We don't need to. And if you notice here, I'm sending across the nonce that we create. So how did we create that nonce? Well, when we look at the form, we can see that we're using the function create nonce, and it has to be called this. We don't have the option of different names. It's in that there's a reference in the handout to the developer handbook to explain this, but it must be this, and it must be sent as this field to make everything work, both logged in and logged out. So all we do is we create a hidden input, a session ID, a nonce, and we send it on the form to the site. And when we get there, we're checking it. But when we come to the callback function, we just do standard WordPress PHP. We get all the parameters. And when we come down here, we do our check. Is this nonce verified? Yes or no? This is the name that's stored in the server. This is the one that's been sent. And it will come back with either saying it's failed, it's less than 12 hours old, or between 12 and 24 hours old, pardon me. And if it's valid, 1 or 2, I'm just inserting a post and sending back a custom message. So let's see this in action. So let's go to post nonce. And notice straight away, if I do this, this is the default error message because the server is expecting these parameters. So let's just refresh the page. Let's call it test nonce. Let's send it. And we get back whatever we want to send back. But what's important to us is I declared, as we saw here, I'm sending back all of this data. So let's just have a look at it. I'm saying it's successful. Notice here we get that nonce. That's the code that was created. And we can send it as form data, or we can even send it in the headers. And for debug, I produced it here. Now, this will only happen if we were on that page. And this is a prevention against cross-site resource forgery, where somebody else we get sent to a malicious link that then uses our cookies to send them across to the server to impersonate us. So this is the WP-Nonce mechanism. Now, this is all quite a lot to take in a talk like this, but it's giving a higher view, and with the code, you'll be able to work it through and all the references. So let's summarize what we've done. We're using AJAX to effectively create a single page application. Notice how it doesn't refresh up here. I can get data using any of the endpoints. And we had a look at various different endpoints that would come back the JSON data. And we also had a look when we looked at the page AJAX, how when we get that data back, what's the code snippet that when we get the data, how we can process it. We also had a look at sending forms. We had a look also at the nonce and how that wires in with a form with a hidden field. And just to go back to that, if we look at the form page, we go up. Pardon me, lost my place. If we go down, when we're doing the form, we're creating our nonce and we're just adding it to our form field. It's not stored on the HTML form, sent across, analyzed by this endpoint, processed, and a response is sent back. And at that point, we can then hide this field, move to a different section. We can do what we want. But in this example, I've shown here the error message that the endpoint has built in. And we can see test 2. One more time, we look at it here. We go back to home. We will now see that that post has been added. In the last 10 minutes, I want to cover something about headless and decoupled, because originally when I was talking, I talked about decoupled headless WordPress, handling authentication, how by using the REST API and sort of the technologies that HTML sites, JavaScript sites use, we can create offline instant pages, and also how we could export our content and our functionality, add like a widget to any site for either increased exposure or as a service or as a way of connecting businesses, of sharing resources. So what I'm going to do in the time is, when I started, I had the view of the internet that there was HTML and all the different frameworks. And for me, WordPress, as lovely as I found it, I felt like there was a wall stopping me between the two. And as I started getting into JavaScript, I came across the International JavaScript Conference, London 28. The keynote speech was about making Angular, React, Vue into what's called web components, which are the native APIs of the browser, so that they could all coexist and didn't require the framework to be on the page. So that you might have an app that has a bit of Angular, a bit of React, a bit of Vue, they could connect with each other. So that kind of makes it slightly different. The frameworks can use web components, they can talk to each other, and they can also work on an HTML page together. So that rather than having a framework, you have the right component for the job. It could be a Vue component in one instance, could be an Angular in the next. So how could we make WordPress be the same and join in and just be essentially almost like another framework that can then interact with other frameworks, that can deploy its content and functionality into the frameworks or into HTML pages, into PHP pages or Gutenberg blocks? So what I'm going to do in the short time we've got left is actually show this in action. This is the site here. Now, the first thing to notice is if I go to the home page, we're on HTML on a totally different domain, and there's no WordPress at all here. Yet here I'm managing to show a post, this particular post here. I can click. And what I'm doing is I'm embedding everything in my own custom HTML tag, which I can create, called show post. And you can see the post ID here. So as a little demo without too much explanation, because there's a fair bit in it, but to show the kind of concept, if I go to elements, for example, and into main and see that div element in here, post 109 here. If I change it back, click that, that's come back here. If I want to display a whole category of information, and I'm going to wind this down, I can show a whole blog post on the page. And in fact, everything on this page is a web component. It's all custom. The navigation bar, you can't see it, the back to top button here. These are all web components. They're standard browser, they can work wherever there is HTML. For example, if I have a blog, I can show my blog posts here. the interesting part about this is because it's in the JavaScript object, if I go to the network tab and go offline, this works. And actually, these are now instant pages because they're really stored in the browser and we're working offline. What we can also do to make our WordPress, and this is a WordPress site, although each of these could be deployed anywhere as a service or as an extension or as advertising, we can also build components that have the lazy load facility within them. And as it crosses the red bar, the image gets put in. So we can design pages that below the fold will preload. Authentication is one issue when we have a decoupled site. How do we know who the person is rather than having to pass in their password? This is one complete WordPress component. If I click this and go to source, we can see here that the only thing here is a special custom tag I've made with a script file, the two files I said that we can deploy WordPress anywhere to create the login facility. And what I'm going to do in here, to zoom back down, is type in my email, and I'm going to our original Udemy site. And this has built-in validation. You can see it all working here. This will go, validate, and returns a JSON web token, which I'm just displaying here, that I can now save in local storage in a cookie. That becomes our session ID, so that when we're decoupled, the user feels like they're part of the site. So that's the question of authentication. How do we authenticate when we're doing a decoupled site? Because this is completely decoupled. Finally, with offline, what I did on the home page, we can use progressive web app enhancements. I'm going to go into the application tab. We look at IndexedDB. This is the browser's own database. It's a little transactional database. I've loaded in all the posts for a number of different categories. They're now in the browser. I also cached in the special cache API the pages to make my site. What we've done here is we've created a local version of our WordPress site, which means we have very fast access, instant access, which also works, and I've been playing around with it today, offline. So I'm now offline. I've got the whole WordPress site on the user's device. It's instant pages, under 100 milliseconds, provided the device has its power and is a modernish one. So we're offline and we're getting instant access. And that's using the browser's IndexedDB, which is basically my MySQL, the cache API, the one that we're allowed to use. I can store all these different pages so that it's now like our local web server. So for WordPress optimization, one way is to sort of move to an HTML. It can be a PHP page, but it can be basically out of the stack using JSON data and very simply connecting using the IndexedDB and the cache storage. It can be done in WordPress itself in the ecosystem. I just am more familiar with the HTML version, but this is how we can now create instant pages under 100 milliseconds and offline capability using the WordPress REST API. And for example, on the sorry, I've gone offline. On the WordCamp Central, they give us a REST API so that we can use to display meetings. And I'm displaying just the last 10 meetings. I can create a little utility where we could have a one-stop shop of register, flight, etc. But the idea behind this is that if I was marketing WordCamps, I could create a tiny little widget that gets put onto anyone's site without requiring a developer. Because the code that's involved here, as we see, is just this custom HTML tag and a script file, a bit like a YouTube embed. So with the last few minutes, I'm going to go back to the presentation. And what are the implications of the REST API and AJAX? Well, we've seen how we can speed up our own WordPress pages in our WordPress site if we're in the WordPress ecosystem. But now by taking it out using decoupled WordPress sites, creating WordPress components, web components, using the REST API, we're able to put bits of WordPress anywhere on the internet. We're no longer restricted to the 1/3 of the internet. We can be compiled into frameworks. We can be compiled into HTML pages. Web components, Felix Arntz and Rob Lewis have spoken at WordCamps about how you can make web components and literally just drop them into Gutenberg blocks without having to kind of do React code to actually make your Gutenberg block. These web components are native HTML that extend the element class. They're part of the browser. And because we have the REST API, we are now able to use them and effectively be another framework in the HTML world. We no longer need to feel that we're trapped only in our stack, as large and as powerful as it is. We can now be anywhere on the internet with increased exposure, increased SEO, components as a service, providing useful content, valuable content that we have on our WordPress sites. So there's a lot to take in. You have the code, the handbook, and what I do is I offer many no-fee online workshops on the REST API. If you want to go a bit deeper or you want to have questions or learn how to use it, contact me and I'm going to set up a number of online workshops so that we can go through it. Because having seen the implications of the web component and the REST API, that WordPress can now be 100% internet. There is nowhere on the internet that has HTML that WordPress cannot be in some form or another. That we no longer really have to think of how many sites are WordPress. We can possibly add on to that how many sites use a bit of WordPress. So that's me, Craig West. Do contact me. I love to learn. I love to teach. And we now stop with questions if there are any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Craig. I do have a question here from Joel. He said, I'm curious, I heard you shouldn't output PHP code into JavaScript files. I see that you are. Is that a best practice, or should we push PHP variables with WP localize?
Very good question. In the page code, I say this is not the right practice. I have in the code given a localized script. But what I'd like to show you is I've done that. If I do Control U to inspect the source, and I do Control F for C data, if you can see on every page, those objects are available. There's a dummy nonce. So that's, I am doing it and it's in the code. I didn't go into detail and it's a very good question. It's up to the person to think, would they want this type of information available on any page? If somebody wants to crack the site, they know where to look. So yes, that is absolutely correct. We do use that. And in the sample pack, there is the WP localize version of how to add. Those were the nonces. Those were the data that I put there. So very good question. That's my response. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Great. I think the part on session authentication was very interesting because I have not seen that yet in a REST API demo, so I appreciated that. And then Olga, I don't know if you have the chat up still, but Olga is asking about the implications with speed with using the REST API. If you're able to use the functionality through plugins or themes, all the loading anyway, would there be a benefit in speed?
AJAX, we just make one, if I get the question correctly, everything speeds up the site. If you're using AJAX, you're just making one network request and you're not going through the process of it all coming back. I think I don't know, to be honest, whether those plugins solve all of that issue. They probably do. This is a useful tool, and I think it does speed up because obviously you're only requesting a smaller part. So if the question is correct, I mean, would we need AJAX for speed if we've got good plugins? Probably not, because the Google AMP plugin does maybe something similar. And that's probably doing that type of process for you. I don't know if that answers the question. Thank you.
All right, and Craig will be available in our Slack channel after. If you have questions, let us know in the YouTube chat. Thank you so much, Craig.
And please do take me up on the offer. This is what the REST API is, very powerful. Very happy to teach people and spend time, no charge. Thank you very much.